He rode into town planning to leave in 3 days. By sundown, someone had already decided he wouldn't make it out at all. The dust sat heavy in the air, clinging to Ethan Cole's coat as his horse slowed to a quiet stop outside the saloon. Leather creaking, sunlight cutting through the swinging doors in thin, golden blades. Nothing looked unusual at first glance. Men leaning on posts, boots on railings, a card game half played near the window. But the silence wasn't right. Not the easy kind that comes with heat and long afternoons. This one held its breath like something waiting to happen. Ethan noticed it the way a man notices a storm before it breaks, not with his eyes, but somewhere deeper, somewhere older. He stepped down, boots hitting the packed dirt with a dull thud, one hand resting near his belt, but not on the gun. Never first, never unless needed. 3 days, he told himself. Just long enough to rest the horse, pick up supplies, and ride west before sunrise on the 4th. That had been the plan. Plans didn't mean much out here. The batwing doors groaned as he pushed inside, and every sound softened. The scrape of chairs, the low murmur of voices, the faint clink of glass against wood. Then even those faded. The bartender paused mid-wipe, rag hanging still in his hand. A man at the far table stopped shuffling cards. No one said a word. Ethan had seen towns like this before, places where strangers weren't welcomed so much as measured, weighed, judged without a single question asked. He gave a small nod, polite, nothing more, and walked to the bar, the scent of whiskey and old timber thick in the air. Coffee, he said, voice steady, neutral. The bartender hesitated just long enough to be noticed, then turned away without answering, pouring slowly, like time itself had grown heavy. Ethan felt it then. That pull, that quiet shift in the room, like every pair of eyes had found him without turning their heads. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. Outside, somewhere across the street, a figure stood unmoving. He had seen her before he stepped inside. Just a glimpse, enough to stay with him. Apache. The way she held herself made that clear. Not just the clothes, not just the dark braid resting over her shoulder, but the stillness, the kind that didn't belong to fear. It belonged to control. When he stepped back out into the light, coffee untouched, the heat pressed against his skin like a warning. She hadn't moved. Not an inch. Her eyes were on him now, steady, unreadable, and for a moment the rest of the town seemed to fade around her, like she was the only thing that mattered in that stretch of dust and wood. Then she lifted the rifle. Slow, deliberate, the barrel aligned, not quite at his chest, not quite past him either. Somewhere in between. Ethan didn't reach for his gun, didn't step back, just stood there, the wind brushing faint against his coat, carrying the smell of dry earth and distant rain that would never come. You're in the wrong place, she said, her voice low, even, carrying just enough to reach him without breaking the silence around them. Not a threat. Not exactly. More like a fact. Ethan studied her for a long second, then another, the weight of something unspoken settling between them. Only for 3 days, he answered. Her gaze didn't change. Not softer. Not harder. Just certain. Like she knew something he didn't. Like she had already seen how this would end. The rifle didn't waver. Somewhere behind him, a board creaked. A boot shifted. A breath caught. Ethan didn't turn. He had the strange, quiet feeling that if he moved too fast, too suddenly, the town itself might close in around him. The woman's finger rested near the trigger, but not on it. Careful. Controlled. Watching. Protecting, or deciding. It wasn't clear which. Not yet. And in that still moment, under a sun that burned everything down to truth, Ethan realized something simple and sharp as steel. He hadn't just ridden into a town. He had stepped into something already in motion. And whether he stayed 3 days or 3 minutes wasn't going to be his choice anymore. The rifle lowered just enough to mean something, though not enough to offer comfort. And the woman turned before Ethan could say another word, her steps quiet against the dust as if the ground itself made room for her to pass, leaving him standing in the open street with the weight of unseen eyes pressing harder than the noon heat. A door creaked somewhere to his left, then shut again, quick, like a mistake corrected too late, and when Ethan finally moved, it was slow, deliberate, the way a man walks when he knows the ground beneath him might shift without warning, boots scraping softly as he crossed toward the hitching post, fingers brushing the worn leather of his saddle, grounding himself in something familiar, something honest, because nothing else in that town felt that way. Across the street, two men spoke in low voices, stopping the moment he glanced their direction, their hats dipping just enough to hide their expressions. In it was not fear he saw in them, not even anger, but something colder, something decided long before he arrived, like they had already written the ending and were only waiting for him to catch up to it. Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes drifting to the far edge of town where the land stretched wide and empty, the kind of open space a man could disappear into if he chose, if he turned around right now, mounted up, and rode without looking back. But the feeling in his chest told him it would not matter. Whatever had started here would follow, quiet and patient, until it finished what it had begun. The sound of footsteps reached him again, softer this time, and he did not need to turn to know she had returned. That same still presence settling just behind him like a shadow that did not belong to the sun. And when she spoke, her voice carried low, steady, close enough that he could hear the breath between her words. "You should have left when I told you." Ethan did not look at her right away, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if measuring distance, as if calculating something only he could see. Then he gave the smallest shake of his head. 3 days, he said again, quieter now, not stubborn, not defiant, just certain in a way that surprised even him. And for a moment there was nothing but the wind moving through the empty spaces between buildings, carrying dust in slow spirals that rose and fell like something alive. She stepped closer, close enough that he could catch the faint scent of smoke and sage on her clothes, something clean beneath the grit of the town, something that did not belong to it. And when he finally turned to face her, her eyes were already on him, searching, weighing, not the way the others had, not like a judge passing sentence, but like someone trying to decide whether he was worth the cost of something he did not yet understand. "You do not know what they think you are," she said, her voice softer now, almost lost in the space between them, and Ethan felt that same quiet shift again, the sense that every word here carried more than it should, that meaning moved under the surface like a current you could not see until it pulled you under. "Then tell me," he replied, simple, direct, and for the first time her expression changed. Not much, just a flicker, like a thought she had not planned to have. But it passed as quickly as it came, and she stepped back, the distance returning between them as if it had never closed at all. "It would not matter," she said, "because they have already decided," and the way she said it made the word they feel heavier than the heat, heavier than the silence, like something larger than the men he had seen, larger than the town itself. Ethan followed her gaze then, past the buildings, past the empty road, to where a single rider sat far at the edge of sight, still as stone, watching, and something in the way the horse stood, in the way the man did not move, told him this was not chance, not coincidence, but part of whatever had been waiting long before he arrived. And when he looked back to the woman, she was already turning away again, the rifle resting easy in her hands, not raised, not lowered, just there, like a promise not yet spoken. And Ethan understood one thing with a clarity that cut through everything else. She was not the danger in this town. She was the only reason he had not met it yet. The rider at the edge of town did not move, and that was what made him impossible to ignore, the kind of stillness that did not belong to rest but to waiting, like a man who had already chosen his moment and was simply letting time catch up to it. And Ethan felt that same quiet tension settle deeper in his chest as he reached for his saddlebag, fingers brushing against worn canvas until they found what he needed, a small folded cloth. Nothing special to anyone else, but to him. It carried weight, the kind that came from years and miles and things that never quite left a man alone. He pulled it free and unwrapped it slowly, revealing the silver pendant inside, dull from travel, but still catching light where the edges had been polished by time. And for a brief second the world around him seemed to fall away, replaced by memory, by a voice long gone, by a promise he had never fully understood until now. A faint sound behind him broke the moment, not loud, not sharp, just enough to remind him where he stood. And when he turned, the street had changed again, not in appearance but in feeling. The men were closer now, not openly surrounding him, not yet, but the space between them had narrowed, like a circle that had not decided to close but was already thinking about it. Ethan slipped the pendant back into the cloth, tucking it into his pocket with care, his movements unhurried, controlled. because anything faster might have given them what they were waiting for. And he was not ready to hand that over, not without understanding why. The woman stood across from him again, closer than before, her rifle resting at her side, not raised, not threatening, but never out of reach, and her eyes followed the motion of his hand as he secured the pendant. Something shifting there, something sharper than before, recognition, or maybe memory. It was hard to tell. "You carry something that does not belong to this place," she said, her voice low enough that it did not travel beyond them. And Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "Maybe it does," he answered, and the words hung between them, simple on the surface but heavier underneath, like both of them knew there was more being said than either was willing to explain. She studied him for a long second, then another, her head tilting just slightly, the way a person listens not to words but to what sits behind them. And for the first time, there was something like doubt in her expression, not weakness, not uncertainty, but a question she had not expected to ask. "Before you came here," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "who told you to ride this way?" Ethan let out a quiet breath, the kind that carried no humor, no ease. "No one," he replied, "just the road." And something in that answer seemed to settle something in her, not resolve it, not completely, but enough that her shoulders shifted, just a fraction, as if a weight had changed shape rather than disappeared. The wind moved again, lifting dust in thin lines that traced the edges of the street, and somewhere a loose shutter tapped softly against wood, the only sound in a town that felt like it had forgotten how to speak. The rider at the edge of town was closer now, not by much, maybe 20 yards, but enough that the shape of him was clearer, the dark coat, the hat pulled low, the posture too straight to be casual, and Ethan could feel the attention coming from him like heat from a fire you could not see, steady, constant, patient. "You should not be here," the woman said again, but this time it was different, not a warning, not an order, something closer to regret. And Ethan found himself studying her the way she had studied him, the lines of her face, the steadiness in her stance, the way she held the rifle not as a threat but as a responsibility, like it was not a weapon but a choice she had already made. "Maybe I am exactly where I am supposed to be," he said, and the words surprised him as much as they seemed to reach her, because for a brief moment her eyes softened, just enough to let something human through the control, something that did not belong to the distance she kept between herself and everything else. Then it was gone, replaced by that same calm, that same readiness, as she turned slightly, positioning herself not in front of him, not beside him, but just off to the side, where her line of sight extended past him toward the rider who had finally begun to move, slow, deliberate, closing the distance inch by inch. And in that quiet shift of her stance, Ethan understood something without needing it spoken. Whatever was coming, it was no longer just about him, and whatever role he had stepped into, she had already chosen, hers long before he arrived. The rider's horse moved at a slow, measured pace, each step pressing into the dust like it had all the time in the world, and that was what made it dangerous, not speed, not urgency, but certainty, the kind that came from knowing no one would stop you. Ethan did not shift his stance, but his attention narrowed, the way a man focuses when the edges of the world begin to matter less than the space directly in front of him, and beside him, just off his shoulder, the woman adjusted her footing by half an inch, subtle enough that most would miss it, but Ethan felt it like a change in the air, like the moment before a storm decides whether it will break or pass. The town had gone quieter than before, if that was even possible. Doors remained closed, windows dark, the men who had been watching now pretending not to, but their presence pressed in from every side, a ring without shape, a boundary without lines. The rider came closer, 10 yards now, maybe less, and the details sharpened, the coat worn but clean, the boots polished despite the road, and the way he held himself, upright, composed, like he belonged wherever he chose to stand, even here. He stopped a few feet away, not directly facing Ethan, but angled just enough that both Ethan and the woman remained in his sight, a careful positioning that spoke of habit rather than thought. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried easily across the still air, smooth, controlled. "You took your time getting here." Ethan felt the words settle before he answered. "I was not aware I was expected." The man's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile. more like an acknowledgement of something already known. Everyone is expected somewhere, he replied, and his gaze flicked briefly toward the woman, then back to Ethan, though nothing in his expression suggested surprise at her presence. The woman did not respond, did not shift, her rifle still resting low but ready, her eyes fixed not on the man's face but on his hands, watching for something that had not yet happened, and Ethan noticed that, the precision of her attention, the way she chose what mattered. You have something that belongs to me, the rider said after a moment, his tone unchanged, calm enough to almost pass for polite, and Ethan felt the weight of the pendant in his pocket as if it had grown heavier, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant to the man standing in front of him. I do not carry anything with your name on it, Ethan answered, steady, not dismissive, just true in the way he understood truth, and for a brief second, the air tightened, not with threat, but with expectation, like the space itself was waiting to see who would step first. The rider's eyes shifted again, this time lingering on the woman a fraction longer, as if measuring something unseen. Then he spoke again, softer now, almost thoughtful. It is interesting, the company you keep. Ethan did not follow the glance, did not turn, but he could feel her presence more clearly than before, not behind him, not separate, but aligned, like two lines that had not crossed yet, but were moving toward the same point. She is not my company, Ethan said, and the words came out simpler than he expected, honest without intention, and beside him, the woman's grip on the rifle shifted just slightly, not tightening, not loosening, just enough to mark the moment. No, the rider agreed. Quietly, that would make things easier. The wind moved again, brushing across the street, carrying a thin layer of dust between them, softening the edges of everything for just a heartbeat, and when it settled, nothing had changed, and yet everything felt closer to something that had already been decided. You should leave the town, the woman said then, her voice cutting through the stillness not as a plea, not as a command, but as a final line drawn where there had been none before, and for the first time, the rider's attention rested fully on her, not dismissive, not hostile, but curious in a way that did not belong to strangers. This does not concern you, he said, calm, measured, and she met his gaze without hesitation. It concerns what is right, she answered, and the words did not rise, did not push, they simply stood, solid and unmoving, like something that could not be argued with because it did not ask to be understood. Ethan felt something shift then, not in the man, not in the town, but in the space between all three of them, like a line had been crossed without anyone taking a step, and the rider exhaled slowly, his posture unchanged, but his eyes darker now, more focused, as if whatever quiet patience he carried had just begun to wear thin. Then we will see what matters more, he said, and though his voice remained even, there was something beneath it now, something that suggested the moment they had all been waiting for was no longer distant, no longer uncertain, but already here, standing with them in the dust, waiting for one of them to decide how it would end. The silence stretched thin, like a rope pulled too tight between three men who understood that words had already gone as far as they could, and Ethan felt the weight of that moment settle into his bones, not as fear, not even as tension, but as recognition, the kind that comes when a man realizes he has stepped into something that began long before him and will not end just because he chooses to walk away. The rider's eyes remained fixed on him, steady, patient, but there was something else. There now, something sharper, as if the conversation had shifted from possibility to inevitability, and Ethan's hand brushed lightly against his coat, not reaching for anything, just reminding himself of what he carried, of what had brought him here without him ever knowing it. The woman moved then, just a fraction, placing herself half a step closer to Ethan's side, not enough to claim space, just enough to change the shape of it, and the rider noticed, his gaze flicking between them with a quiet calculation that did not need to be spoken. You do not understand what you are holding, the rider said, his voice calm, but firmer now, and Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. Then explain it, he replied, and for the first time, the rider hesitated, not long, not enough for most to see, but it was there, a brief pause where certainty gave way to consideration, as if he were deciding how much truth the moment could carry. That pendant was taken from a place it should never have left, he said finally, his words careful, measured, like each one had been chosen long before this conversation began. It does not belong to you. Ethan let the statement settle, not rejecting it, not accepting it, just holding it where it could be seen clearly, and beside him. The woman's eyes shifted again, this time not toward the rider, but toward Ethan's pocket, toward the place where the pendant rested, and there was no doubt in her expression now, no question, only recognition, deep and certain, like something remembered rather than discovered. It belonged to someone who saved a life, Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying less distance than before, and the rider's jaw tightened just slightly. The first real crack in the calm he had carried so far. That is one way to tell the story, he replied, and the words carried a weight that suggested there were others, versions that did not end the same way. The wind moved again, lifting dust between them, and for a moment the world blurred at the edges, the lines between man and ground and sky softening just enough to feel unreal. And when it cleared, nothing had changed, except the understanding that now stood between them. The woman stepped forward then, not toward the rider, not fully toward Ethan, but into the space between, her presence quiet but undeniable, and when she spoke, her voice held something it had not before, something deeper. This is not his fight, she said, and the rider's eyes settled on her fully now, not dismissive, not curious, but focused, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. Everything that crosses into this place becomes part of it, he answered, and there was no anger in his tone, no threat, just a statement delivered with the same calm certainty he had carried since he arrived. She did not look away, did not lower her gaze. Then you are wrong, she said, and the words fell into the dust between them like something solid, something that would not be moved by reason or force. Ethan felt the shift again, sharper this time, like the moment before something breaks, not loudly, not violently, but quietly, in a way that cannot be undone. And he understood then that whatever this pendant was, whatever story it carried, it was not just a memory, it was a line drawn across time, and he had stepped onto it without knowing where it led. The rider exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling as if a decision had been reached, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not louder, not harsher, but final in a way that left no space for anything else. Then we will let the truth decide, he said, and though the words were simple, the meaning behind them stretched far beyond the three of them, reaching into the town, into the past, into something that had been waiting long before Ethan rode in. And as the dust settled once more, Ethan realized that whatever came next would not be about leaving in 3 days. It would be about whether he was ever meant to leave at all. The words settled into the dust like something that could not be taken back, and for a long moment no one moved. Not the rider, not the woman, not even the men watching from behind half-closed doors, as if the entire town had stepped into a single held breath. Ethan felt the stillness press in around him, heavier now, shaped by what had been said and what had not, and he reached slowly into his coat, not hurried, not cautious, just deliberate, drawing out the folded cloth once more, the motion, enough to draw every eye without a single sound being made. The rider's gaze sharpened, not with surprise, but with expectation, like he had known this moment would come and had simply been waiting for Ethan to arrive at it on his own. The woman did not move, but Ethan could feel her attention shift fully to his hand, to the cloth, to what lay inside it. And for the first time since he had entered the town, there was something in the air that did not belong to tension, something quieter, something older, like memory rising to meet the present. Ethan unfolded the cloth slowly, the silver pendant catching the light as it emerged, dull but steady, the kind of shine that comes not from polish but from years of being held, carried, remembered, and for a brief second, even the wind seemed to pause, as if the land itself recognized it. The rider took a small step forward, not enough to close the distance, just enough to change it, and when he spoke, his voice was lower now, stripped of the calm distance it had carried before. Where did you get that? The question did not sound like a challenge, not even like a demand, but something closer to necessity, like the answer mattered more than anything else that had been said so far. Ethan looked at the pendant, then back at the man. From my mother, he said, simple, steady, and the words landed with a weight that shifted everything, subtle but Undeniable. The rider's expression changed then, not in a way most would notice, but Ethan saw it. A tightening at the edge of his jaw, a flicker in his eyes that spoke of recognition, of something long buried being brought back to the surface without warning. She told me it came from someone who saved her life, Ethan continued, his voice quieter now, not for effect, but because the memory demanded it. Said that person did not ask for anything in return, and beside him, the woman's breath. Caught. Not loudly, not enough to draw attention, but enough that Ethan felt it. A shift so small it might have gone unnoticed if everything else had not been so still. The rider exhaled slowly, his posture changing by a fraction, the certainty he had carried now tempered by something else, something less rigid, less final. And when he spoke again, the words came with a different weight. Your mother. Where was she? Ethan held his gaze, not searching for advantage, not guarding anything, just answering as it was, near the river north of here. Many years ago, she was sick, alone, said she would not have made it through the winter if not for them. The word them lingered, unfinished but understood, and for the first time, the rider looked away, just briefly, his eyes dropping to the ground as if the dust held something he needed to see. The woman stepped forward then, closer than she had been before, her voice low but steady. It was her, she said, not to Ethan, not entirely, but to the space between them, to the truth that had been circling without landing. My grandmother was the healer, and the words settled into place like the final piece of something long incomplete, and Ethan felt it, not as a revelation, not as surprise, but as recognition, like something he had carried without understanding had finally found its shape. The rider looked up again, his gaze moving between them, the lines of conflict still there, still present, but no longer as clear as before, and the town around them seemed to shift with it, the silence no longer sharp, but uncertain, like it no longer knew which way to lean. The pendant rested in Ethan's open hand, catching the light between them, no longer just an object, no longer just a story, but a bridge that none of them had planned to stand on. And in that quiet moment, it became clear that whatever was coming next would not be decided by force, but by what each of them chose to remember and what they were willing to honor. The air did not break, but it changed, like a storm that had decided to pass without rain, leaving everything behind heavier, quieter, harder to ignore, and Ethan closed his fingers slowly around the pendant, not hiding it, not claiming it, just holding it as if it had finally become what it was meant to be. The rider watched that motion with a gaze no longer fixed on possession but on something deeper, something unsettled. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost the sharp edge it carried before, replaced by something older, something that belonged to memory rather than intent. She stayed alive because of that healer, he said, not asking, not doubting, just stating what he now understood to be true. The woman stood still beside Ethan, her eyes steady, her presence no longer just protective but rooted, like she was no longer standing between two men but between two truths that had not yet decided how to exist together. She did not just save her, the woman said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of something passed down. My grandmother gave her shelter, gave her food when we had little, and told her that kindness is not a debt, it is a path. And the words settled into the space between them with a quiet authority that no one challenged, not even the rider. Ethan listened without turning, the meaning of it unfolding slowly, not as a surprise, but as something that had always been there, waiting for the moment it would be seen clearly. The rider exhaled, long and slow, his shoulders easing just enough to show the shift, and when he looked at Ethan again, there was no calculation left, no quiet threat, only a man standing at the edge of a decision he had not expected to make. Then you know why that pendant matters, he said, and Ethan nodded once, not out of agreement, but out of understanding. It is not mine to keep, Ethan replied, the words coming steady, certain, and for a moment, the town itself seemed to lean closer, as if even the walls and windows were listening for what would follow. The woman's gaze moved to him then, sharp but not surprised, as if she had already known this was where he would stand, and something in her expression softened, not openly, not in a way anyone else would see, but enough that it changed the silence around her. The man who owned that pendant died protecting this land, the rider said, his voice quieter now, not heavy, not dramatic, just real, and his eyes shifted to the horizon for a brief second. Before returning, it was taken after he fell, lost somewhere between stories that were never told the same way twice. Ethan felt the weight of those words settle into him, not as judgment, not as accusation, but as context, as the kind of truth that does not demand anything but still changes everything. Then it should go back, Ethan said, simple, without hesitation, and the woman took a step forward, slow, deliberate, her eyes never leaving his face. You would give it up without knowing what it means to you, she asked, and there was no challenge in her tone, only a question that mattered. Ethan looked at her then, really looked, seeing not just the rifle, not just the stance, but the person behind both, the one who had chosen to stand where she did long before he arrived. And he gave the smallest shake of his head. I think I know exactly what it means, he said. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the dust in a slow arc that passed between them like something being drawn away. And the rider nodded once, a motion so slight it almost went unseen. But it was enough to shift the ground beneath all of them. Then the truth is already decided, he said, and there was no finality in his voice this time. No edge, just acceptance, the kind that comes when a man realizes the outcome was never his to control. Ethan opened his hand, the pendant resting in his palm once more, catching the fading light. And without ceremony, without hesitation, he held it out toward the woman, not as an offering, not as a surrender, but as a return, and in that quiet gesture, something larger than any of them seemed to settle into place, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Her hand did not move right away, and that hesitation carried more weight than anything spoken before, as if the space between Ethan's open palm and her fingers held years of memory that could not be crossed lightly. The pendant rested there, catching the late afternoon light, a small piece of silver that now seemed to carry more than a single story, more than a single life, and the woman studied it not as an object, but as something that had found its way back through time without asking permission. The town remained still, but it was no longer the same stillness, no longer sharp with suspicion. Now it felt uncertain, like something had shifted that no one knew how to respond to, and even the men behind the windows no longer looked at Ethan the same way. Their silence no longer chosen, but unsure. Slowly, the woman reached forward, her fingers steady but careful, not rushed, not hesitant, just aware. And when she took the pendant from Ethan's hand, the contact was brief, but it carried a quiet finality, like the closing of something that had been left open for too long. She turned the pendant slightly between her fingers, the silver glinting as it caught the fading sun, and for a moment her eyes softened, not with emotion that could be named, but with recognition, the kind that comes when something lost is no longer lost. The rider watched this without interruption, his posture no longer rigid, his presence no longer pressing, and when he spoke, his voice had changed. Again, no longer carrying expectation, only acknowledgement. It belongs with you, he said, and there was no resistance in it, no claim left to defend, only acceptance of what had already been decided without force. The woman did not look at him when she answered. It was never ours to keep, her voice low, steady, and the words seemed to settle deeper than the dust beneath their feet, reaching into something beyond ownership, beyond right or wrong. Ethan stepped back then, just half a step, not retreating, not distancing, just giving space where it was no longer needed for him to stand. And in that small movement, the tension that had held the moment together began to loosen, not breaking, just fading, like a knot slowly undone. The rider glanced once more at Ethan, and there was something there now that had not been before. Not respect exactly, not gratitude, but something close to both, something unspoken that did not need to be named to be understood. You came here by chance, he said, and Ethan shook his head slightly, the answer already clear to him now. I do not think so, he replied, and the rider gave a small nod, as if that confirmed something he had only just begun to see. The wind moved through the town again, softer this time, carrying away the last of the sharp edges that had defined the moment, and the sounds began to return, faint at first, a door opening, a chair shifting, life stepping cautiously back into place, as if unsure it was allowed. The woman closed her fingers around the pendant, then lifted it slowly, not placing it around her neck, not hiding it away, just holding it where it could be seen, where it could exist in the open without needing explanation. And when she finally looked at Ethan again, her eyes were no longer guarded in the same way, no longer measuring him against something unseen, but seeing him as he stood, as he had chosen to be. "You should leave before nightfall," she said, but the words were different now. Not a warning, not a push, something closer to care than either of them would say aloud. And Ethan nodded once, understanding not just the words, but what sat beneath them. The rider turned his horse then, slow, deliberate, not as a man retreating, but as one who had reached the end of his part in something larger. And without another word, he began to ride back the way he had come, the distance between them growing not with tension, but with quiet resolution. Ethan watched him go for a moment, then turned back to the woman, the town around them no longer closing in, no longer waiting, just existing again, and in the fading light, with the dust settling and the silence no longer heavy. He understood that what had brought him here was never about staying 3 days. It was about what a man chooses to carry, and what he chooses to return when the time comes. The sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the street as the heat finally began to loosen its grip, and for the first time since Ethan had arrived, the town exhaled, not all at once, but in small, uncertain ways. A door left open a second longer, a voice returning where silence had lived, boots shifting without hesitation. Ethan adjusted the reins in his hand, the leather warm from the day, and his horse gave a slow, steady breath, as if it too could feel the difference, the weight that had settled now lifting just enough to let movement return. He did not rush, did not reach for his saddle right away, because something in him understood that leaving was no longer about time, not 3 days, not even one. It was about the moment itself, and when that moment ended, so would his place in it. The woman stood a few feet away, the pendant now resting against her palm, her fingers loosely closed around it as if she had not yet decided whether to keep it hidden or let it remain in the open, and the rifle hung quietly at her side. No longer a line between life and death, just a part of her, like the land beneath her feet. They stood there without speaking, the kind of silence that did not ask to be filled, because everything that needed to be said had already found its place between them, not in words, but in choices made without hesitation. Ethan finally moved, stepping toward his horse, his boots pressing into the same dust that had held him still hours before, but now it did not feel the same. It did not hold him, did not measure him. It simply let him pass. He rested a hand on the saddle, pausing for a brief second, not to think, not to decide, but to remember. And when he turned back, his eyes met hers one last time. There was no smile, no nod, nothing that would mark the moment for anyone else to see. But something passed between them anyway, something quiet and certain, the kind of understanding that does not need to be carried because it stays where it was made. "You knew," he said finally, his voice low, not questioning, just stating what had become clear, and she held his gaze without flinching. "I hoped," she answered, and that was enough, more than enough. Ethan gave the smallest nod, then turned and mounted his horse in one smooth motion, the leather creaking softly as he settled into place. And when he took the reins, there was no hesitation left in him, no uncertainty about direction or distance. He did not look back right away, guiding the horse forward at a steady pace, the town opening in front of him, no longer closing in, no longer watching, just letting him go the way a place does when it no longer has anything to prove. The sound of hooves against the packed dirt echoed softly, steady, even, and with each step, the weight of the day shifted into something quieter, something that would not leave him, but would no longer press against him either. Halfway to the edge of town, he slowed just slightly, not stopping, just enough to turn his head, and there she stood, exactly where he had left her, unmoving, the pendant now lifted, resting against the light, not hidden, not claimed, just held. The wind moved once more, catching the edge of her hair, carrying the scent of dust, and something cleaner beyond it, something that did not belong to the town, and for a brief second, it felt like the world had narrowed to that single image, still, quiet, complete. Then Ethan faced forward again, nudging the horse into a steady walk, the road stretching out ahead of him, wide and open, the way it always had been, and as the town faded behind him, It no longer felt like something he had passed through, but something that had passed through him, leaving behind not a mark, but a measure, the kind a man carries without needing to name it out. Here, nothing followed you unless you gave it reason, and some things, once returned, did not need to be carried any further. The dust rose lightly behind him, then settled, and by the time the sun slipped below the horizon, there was no sign he had ever been there at all, except in the quiet way the town now held itself, and in the memory of a woman who had once raised a rifle, not to take a life, but to make sure one kept moving forward.